Hello, I'm Nolly from GGD, and I'm really excited because once again we have a brand new product for you, and it's the first of its type that we've put out, but at the same time it's kind of an old school kind of product because what it is a collection of one-shot kick and snare samples that we've named Slammers. So what Slammers is a collection of heavily processed one-shot samples. These have been recorded, frankly, over the last decade or so. These are samples which I've had in my collection that I've never used for anything. These are all unique. You haven't heard these in any GGD product up to date. And they span a really huge range of sounds, by which I mean we've got very different tunings, different amounts of muffling, very different drums, different studios, different microphones, different preamps. Every single one is completely unique. Many of them recorded in like world-class studios around the world. And I have recently gone through all of these and selected the ones that are the most interesting and kind of curated a collection so that there's very little kind of overlap. So what you're not going to find in Slammers is loads of just variations on a theme. You know, I've certainly had one-shot sample libraries in the past where it kind of feels like there's one or two standout kicks and snares and the rest are just kind of like pale versions of those. And in Slammers, very clearly the goal is that every single snare and kick has a unique vibe. We've given them intuitive names, and I hope that what it's going to do is make using one-shot samples really fun and intuitive for you. And you're not going to be scrambling around being like, oh, is it snare 57 or 58? That's the one that I really like. In terms of the sounds that we've got here, as I say, they're very different source tones, and they've been processed independently, uniquely, but in general, they're all very hard-hitting. These are, hard hits for your kick and snare, as you'd expect for a one-shot sample library. And the goal here is that you can drop these in and really enhance or totally kind of change the vibe of your drum tracks. And that could be a live drum track, and it could also be programmed drums. So what one-shot samples do by nature of just being one single sample is they give this amazing consistency, which means that it's very easy to give that kind of polished rock metal sound to your productions. They're also a really good way of kind of executing scene changes. So if you've got your drum mix and there's a big change of sound, either going a lot heavier or a lot lighter, by kind of switching out the one-shot samples or rebalancing them versus the natural drum sound, you can get like a very different sound very quickly. So it's the kind of the speed and the ease of enhancement that makes one-shot samples really, really powerful. And just one last thing to mention before we get into hearing them, all of these samples are individual, unique drums. None of them are pre-blended, none of them are multiple drums stacked on top of each other. There's no synthetic sounds. They are all phase and time aligned though, so you can blend them to your heart's content and get exactly the sound that you want. Brilliant, so let's have a listen to all of the samples included in the Slammers product. I'm really excited to show you these because I spent a lot of time working on these individually and as a group, finding the best way to process them to give you mix-ready samples that I think sound awesome and versatile without too much overlap. So let's get into it. Let's start with snare drums because let's face it, that tends to be what people care most about, me included. Let's check out the first one. It's called Brassy Bash. So as you can hear, this is a sample. It's got a decent attack, but the transient isn't super pronounced. And instead what we've got is an interesting amount of body to it. There's quite a lot of overtones with a short sustain and a lot of psh kind of quality to it. So this is a very cool sample for blending in when you want an interesting sounding sustain that's not super long and you don't want to be adding too much attack. Let's say your natural snare or the snare that you're working on already has quite a lot of that character. This can be a really good option. Let's check out the next one, Clean Overtone. So as you can hear, this is a very clean sounding sample. There's not much in the way of saturation or compression even, like it's not got an exaggerated transient or sustain. So more than anything, this is for just adding that really nice pure overtone. It's a wood snare drum and it's got like a medium length, I guess you'd say, and kind of like a medium high tuning as well. So it will add a little bit of excitement and length to an otherwise shorter drum. This could be a good one if you want a clean sound, but the main snare sound you're working with maybe's been muffled a lot and doesn't really have much in the way of kind of sustain or overtone. Let's check out the next one, which is quite heavily processed. It's got a room mic as well, which I'm going to mute the first time I play it and then show you that. So it's called Clipped Copper. And then with a room mic. So this is a very short sounding drum and it's been run through a tape machine really hard, and it's actually almost created like a double attack on the front end just because of the way it's crunching so hard. This is a very much a character sample. This can be something that's useful in a whole lot of styles. You could find it interesting blended under a clean sound to add a little bit of dirt. It's also very cool in the kind of context of like maybe hip hop loops or something like that. You could find this is like a cool, very grungy, heavily processed snare sound for that. And the room is very cool as well. It's kind of medium sustain, I'd say. It's not super long, but again, it's got this kind of wide, clipped kind of mid-range thing to it that I think is really beautiful. So that's a nice one. Let's check out the next, Crunchy Birch. So this one, similar kind of tuning and kind of sustain to clean overtone, but this has got a very different sounding transient. This one's gone through a transient designer and then really heavily into some aggressive hard clipping. So we're getting that kind of crunch in a totally different way than we got with the tape saturation on the clipped copper. That's a really cool sounding sample. Let's check out Empty Warehouse Close. Now this is literally a snare drum recorded in an empty warehouse, so it sounds massive. The room mic sample from this is something which I've used in productions for many years now as a kind of snare bomb, so now you guys will have that too. Here's what it sounds like on its own. The actual snare close sounds really cool as well. So that doesn't have a whole load of snare rattle to it. It's mostly like quite a lot of mid and low end punch, which is nice on a kind of medium tuned snare. And then you hear the room mic. You can actually hear the room in the close as well, but with the room mic on, that room is just like an amazing snare bomb sound. You can do more to that. You can run it through a reverb. You can do some extra compression on it if you want to use it as a really blown out kind of breakdown effect. But yeah, I just absolutely love what that does. So what I really like about that sample set is the close for me has quite like an almost kind of CLA snare sound thing, which is really cool. And then that room actually reminds me a little bit of that song Dizzy by Jimmy Eat World, which CLA mixed. I think they recorded the drums for that in one of the band members' garages or something. It's got that kind of uncontrolled room sustain, which I think sounds amazing. So yeah, it's not just for effects. That can be used as like a cool kind of ambient sounding rim shot for like big open beats. Let's check out Glorious Floater. I think, to be honest, this is one of the MVPs in here for sure. Glorious Floater is a really balanced sounding, very impactful, heavy, low end, medium sustain, medium overtone. You'll see what I mean. So this one, I mean, it's just really hard to dislike. You've got that amazing low-end punch, kind of mid-low tuning, I guess. It's not low, but it's on the lower side of medium. Really nice kind of snare wire sound, decent sustain. You know, this to me, it's got echoes of like the Paramore Riot snare, but it doesn't sound like that. But it's that kind of realm of like commercial rock or, you know, really slamming kind of heavy kind of gent kind of stuff. Or you could use this for so much. I mean, I've had access to secret stash one-shot samples from some of like the biggest rock mixers out there, and all of them tend to have a sample in this kind of ballpark in terms of like the attack, the EQ curve, the kind of tuning and the overtones, and those samples, once you hear them, you can kind of tell that those are pretty much the backbone of their entire mixing career. So I'm really proud to offer you guys something which I think is, you know, up to that standard as one of just many options that you could build a whole career around in this pack. Let's move on to Grainy Acro. So let's check that out. That's got a room mic as well. So this one's kind of verging onto higher tuning, medium high. This is a shallow acrolite snare, like a Ludwig aluminium drum, and they kind of have this kind of crunchy character to them. They're very kind of playful and energetic sounding, and I feel like that's captured in this sample. The really nice thing is we've got a huge room sound for it as well, so it's not just like this kind of thin, kind of exciting, but ultimately not super satisfying sample. It's actually got like a really big room sound to it too. So both of these sounds I think are independently very usable, but of course together they make a really good pairing as well. Let's check out Lo Zong. This is a very different sound. So this one almost has like a snom character. If you know, if you're a drummer, you might know what I'm talking about. You get these converted floor toms into, well, you know, they can kind of be both a snare drum and a floor tom. And it's got that like very singular tone kind of ring to it. I call it zong. It's that kind of like hung kind of sound to the drum. Now you do hear this kind of sound, especially in rock. It's actually a really interesting sample when you blend it in under some others, which we'll get to later in this video. But yeah, don't sleep on that one. And the room is actually quite intimate sounding on this one. It's not a really huge, splatty, kind of long sustaining room, which again can be quite useful in a totally different way. But as you'll hear, we've also got some options of very low tuned snares that have bigger room sounds as well. So this is just like another interesting flavour to add to the collection. Maple Slam. So Maple Slam's interesting because it's a wood drum, and there's more of an emphasis on the upper mid-range, and it's slightly kind of clippy sounding in the upper mid-range than there are on some of the other ones. Like if you were to compare that to, say, Glorious Floater, this one, it's got less of that low impact, but what it is really good at is adding a bit of kind of edgy, sticky kind of, I'm talking about stick attack, on the rim shot to an existing drum that maybe is lacking a little bit of that. So it's not as pleasant as some of the other samples when you hear it on its own, but in a blend with other snare sounds can be, really killer. Nice sounding room on that one too. Let's check out Plucky 13. So that's a nice attacky sounding 13-inch snare. It's got like a long, high-tuned ring to it. And it's got a really cool kind of nutcracker attack to it. This one for me, has notes of Sleep Token to it. I think if you're into that kind of sound, which is quite popular at the moment, this could become quite a kind of mainstay in your blends. Let's check out Ring Stinger next. So this is, this kind of stands apart from all the others in the snare selection because it's got this really long, this is just like a wide open drum tuned to a kind of medium tuning where, it's just got loads of ring. And this is the one that you want if you've got the kind of sound, kind of radio rock or something like that, where you need to fill some space with a long kind of sounding ring for that kind of rock effect. You'll notice that the EQ of it is not super high-endy or low-endy. It's mostly mid-range focused. And the idea here is that you can grab this sample when you want to add that ring and mid-range to an otherwise quite kind of dry sounding drum. Again, many pro mixers have a sample like this in their collection, which they'll lean upon, especially in certain moments. A really famous one would be the Murder snare that Randy Staub uses a lot. Which is like a much more out of tune sounding ring, which always kind of bothered me a little bit. But you can hear that on a lot of his productions. That's part of the blend to give the snare a bit of life and kind of lo-fi character. So Ring Stinger, that's one that you might well find lots of use for. Slack Beauty. I really love this sample. For me, it's just got such a nice mid-rangey attack. It's got plenty of low end, and sometimes when you've got a snare drum tuned as low as that, a rim shot can sound kind of flappy and actually quite thin. But this has just got that really nice like character to it that I love. So Slack Beauty, that's a really strong one, and the room sound is really nice on it too. It's kind of really warm and fat and enveloping. This is another one that you could use in lots of different contexts. It can be cool to support a kind of regular rock metal snare with that kind of extra low end and quite pillowy kind of psh sound. But it's also something that you could drop into a more hip hoppy sound. And you could go to an extreme in terms of processing with this one if you want to as well. It could take some really heavy processing and turn into more of an almost electronic sound. Let's check out Sprightly Pop. Now this, another high tune snare with a really nice balance of high, exciting overtones that are not overbearing at all. And just hearing that room sound, you can tell immediately this was recorded at Middle Farm Studio. It just got that lovely, snappy mid-range to it. It's not super bright. It's just got that real explosive energy to it. If you've heard some of our other sample libraries like Modern and Massive or Invasion, or you're familiar with the studio, you might well recognize that kind of snare ambience. So that's another cool one because it's maybe a bit more Deftonesy than Plucky 13. They're both in that high tuning area, but This is a 14-inch drum, so it's more choked because of how high it is than the 13, which is more in its comfort zone. So that's why it's a bit more attack focused and the overtones are a bit more subdued, which is nice as a different kind of vibe. As I say, it's a bit more like a kind of gospel or Deftones sound. This is also like a really cool sample you could use for kind of like thrashy or like kind of death metal stuff if you wanted that more attacking high-tuned snare. Just a couple more to go of the snares, so let's check out Sticky Supra. This is such a different sounding EQ curve. This is all about that like stick attack, so it's that kind of like 1 to 2K area has been really highlighted in this sound. I don't think it's a super pleasant sound on its own, but when you've got a drum where it just feels like you're not hearing that sound of like wood on rim, this can be such a great sample for that. It's also got actually a bit of a kind of Eric Valentine vibe, if you know what I mean. His drum mixes, his snares do tend to have quite a lot of that kind of 1K clack sound to them. So this can be a way of getting a little bit of that into your drum mix. And finally, Tight Squink. So this is another high-tuned drum with a kind of short but interesting overtone to it. This one actually sounds quite a lot like those old Elasis D4 samples that are so popular in kind of modern metal production, especially in the kind of like 2000s to 2010s era. But this is, of course, a natural drum that I've captured. It's just got a little bit of a character like the famous kind of piccolo sample that you hear on so many Andy Sneap and Colin Richardson productions. Not entirely, it's not copying that sound, but that's just what it's reminiscent of. So this is another variation on a high-tuned snare sound. Again, very different to Plucky 13 or Sprightly Pop. This can be a cool one to throw into your blends. Again, very cool for that kind of like 2000s, 2010s metal thing, but also could be really suitable again for your kind of more lo-fi loops thing, because that kind of overtone can be really interesting in a blend and just kind of make something a bit more exciting than something that doesn't have like an interesting sounding little squinky overtone, as I've called it. All right, let's get stuck into the kicks. So let's start with Big Boy. I love this sample. It's got quite a muffled sound, really interesting attack. It's kind of got that really beautiful beater on plastic head kind of sound, but it's not super clicky or kind of plasticky sounding. I really, really like how that sounds. This is a good one for emphasizing the beef and the body with a nice balanced sounding attack. It's not a million miles off what you did hear in the kind of like Zach Savini productions, where it's, or maybe like the Buster Oderholm productions as well, where it's not so much about click, it's about the kind of low mid, low end impact and how that interacts with the rest of the instruments, with the bass and with the master bus processing. Let's check out Blunt Attack. So this one's even kind of darker again. I just went back and played you Big Boy as well, just so you can hear the difference. Comparatively, Big Boy's more transient heavy. This one's got a little bit less of a transient. It's a bit fatter and warmer sounding. Let's check out Chesty Maple. So this one's a little bit brighter, but the brightness has obviously got a kind of saturation character to it as well. So it's not so much about the clean sound of the kick drum being struck. There is this kind of saturated excitement to the high end, which is quite nice. Less focus on the kind of body underneath, but it does still have that kind of chesty feeling on the attack. And the room actually has quite a lot of nice sub punch to it as well that adds to that chestiness, if we just check that out on its own. I should mention throughout, I've been bringing the room mics down a little bit relative to the close mics, just because I've leveled them so that you've got a really healthy level on the room mics. They'd be very dominant in the mix if I played them at unity gain, but when you guys get these samples, the room mics are substantially louder than you're hearing them here. Let's check out Clippy Mids, because this one's got a very cool character to it. So this has got that very 1K kind of clipped mid-range sound, which is cool. Again, a little bit Eric Valentine, just to talk about him once more. I really like how this sounds. This is like a vintage kick drum, like a vintage Ludwig 22-inch kick drum. I really like how this sounds. This for me has, that kind of like almost turnstile sounding kick thing where it's got a lot of mid punch. It's not super clicky and it's got a decent low end to it as well. The room might sound really good as well. The There's actually quite a lot of saturation on the room mic as well, which is awesome. This one probably pairs quite nicely with the clipped copper snare drum. Let's check out Coated Boom. I guess the primary feature with this one is it's got that slightly extended boom, and you can hear a little bit of the floor tom sustain in there as well. So it's a nice one for giving a kick drum a little bit more length. The attack isn't going to be too overbearing when you start blending it up. Let's check out Deep Squish. I think this is probably my favorite one in the pack. I'm not sure. I just love how that sounds. There's something about that attack that's just got that lovely kind of like ratchety kind of clunk kind of sound to it. But at the same time, it's a squishy sounding transient, and it's got a lot of depth. That's why I call it Deep Squish. It's not a harsh sounding upper mid-range. It's like this really nicely kind of wet sounding upper mid-range focus that I find really great. This is killer in a rock production, metal production, so many different things. And this is a 22-inch diameter. It's not a really huge diameter drum, but it's a very deep drum, and you can kind of hear that in the low kind of voice of it. You know, it's got that kind of low timbre to it, even though it's not like a really wide diameter drum. Let's check out Gorilla Cannon. So this one, we're getting into a clickier sound. This is a 24-inch kick drum. It's a center ported one, so it's got a very short sustain, and it's all about that like more clicky sounding attack on the top. But at the same time, it's got that amount of beef and low end that you'd expect from a larger diameter drum. So Gorilla Cannon is one that I find myself coming back to time and time again as well. Now let's check out Hecking Boomer. So Hecking Boomer, it's people often refer to this kind of sound as like the Bonham kind of kick sound. It's a 26-inch drum. It does have a port, but not much muffling inside. And this is such a great drum. A bit like Ring Stinger is in the snare selection. This is such a great drum for adding that mid-range sustain and overtones to an otherwise kind of lifeless sound. This is really good if you've had to gate a kick drum a lot, or you want that kind of like Nickelback modern rock sound. You've got like a big open beat, and you want to, in that moment, have the kick drum have that really nice sustain that's coming from like drum sustain, not room mics. So I'm really proud of that sample, and it's a really nice one just to tuck in a little bit, just to give your kicks a bit more life. Let's go from Hecking Boomer to Hyper Scoop, which, as you can hear, is just about as opposite as you can get. This has got a really clicky attack, very scooped mid-range. This is designed to kind of do the opposite. This is where you've got the mids you like in your kick drum, and you want something that's just going to enhance the attack and the low end a little bit. So this is quite a metal sounding sample. Again, you know, it can be a very interesting thing to blend. Maybe even blending that with Hecking Boomer could be a good choice to kind of get the scoopness of that with the mid-range projection of Hecking Boomer. Let's get on to Knock Knock. So when I'm talking about knock, I'm talking about that like that 1K-ish kind of character, that really like clock kind of sound. Again, to talk about Eric Valentine, you know, that's the kind of kick sound that you might hear from his productions. This is like a larger diameter drum, and yeah, just all focused on that kind of knocky mid-range. It's so good at getting a kick drum to the front of the mix without it sounding clicky. So this is a cool one to drop in when you've got a kick drum that is not quite cutting, but you don't want to hype the top end. This is where a sample like Knock Knock can really come to the forefront and just allow you to get that big rock kick drum without turning it into something that's a bit kind of more modern and metal sounding. The room also sounds cool on that. It's a bit odd on its own, but in the context with the close mic sounds really good. Let's go to Nasty Beast. This for me is like a kind of 80s rock kick drum. You could use this for a lot of things. Well, 80s rock, metal, Randy Stubb production, you know, think kind of Motley Crue, Dr. Feelgood, that kind of stuff. It's a large drum. There's a bit more sustain to it than you tend to get in modern productions. But it's got, yeah, like a really nasty attack to it. This is a really cool one, again, for blending. It's got such a defined character that you can really just add a little bit of it and get a bit of extra nastiness in your drum sound. Just makes things sound a bit more bombastic without kind of going to an extreme of clickiness or kind of Bonham-esque sustain. This is just that kind of like, you know, the heydays of arena rock kind of kick drum sound. So I really like that one. Getting through them, not long to go. So we've got Organic Oak Close next. This one, the nice thing about it is it's not as hyped as any of the others really, or at least in terms of that kind of like modern sounding kick drum. This one's retained more mid-range, it's less hyped on the top and the bottom. And I guess that's why I called it organic, because it has this feeling that's a bit more like a natural kick drum, but it's still got a really pronounced attack, which is going to help cut through the mix. So this can be good if you've got to a place where you feel like your blend or your existing kick drum sound is getting a little bit too kind of fake and disconnected sounding. This can be a good way of kind of reining it back in and making it sound a bit more like an acoustic drum again. And the room has an interesting character to this one. So I often find that kick rooms in isolation don't sound quite like you expect them to. This is probably one of those examples, but in context sounds really cool. So that's organic oak. Let's check out phased clickbait. So this is a sample that uses the kind of anti-phase mixing technique, which I sometimes use, not super frequently, but sometimes, where you deliberately flip the phase on one of the kick drum mics to create this really big scoop. And the kind of change to the attack that takes it away from sounding hard and kind of gives it this slightly wet. I mean, it is technically out of phase, but because of the way that you do it, you've still retained a lot of high-end and bottom-end information. So that's phase clickbait. That's a really good one if you want to add like a bit of like Pantera-y kind of top end to something. It's a characterful one in the kind of metal sphere, I'd say, although it could be interesting to experiment with it in different contexts too. Let's check out tape splat. So this is one a bit like clipped copper, where the tape saturation has almost kind of made it sound like it's got a double attack, which is quite a cool sound. You know, you might not want that as your main kick drum sound, but as something to blend in, it's a very characterful thing that you can do. It's really highlighting the mid-range as well with that saturation. So even though it's a short sound, there's a lot of mid-range character that again can be very useful if you've got a sound which is maybe just lacking a bit of excitement and character. And with the room, that's like a really clipped sounding room. It almost has like a kind of electronic pitch down character. It's not been pitched down, it's just kind of the way that one came out. And that can be a very interesting little sound to blend in as well. Let's check out thick thud. I really love the sound of this one. It does have some high-end stuff, like it's not clicky, but it does have some kind of high-end excitement. But what I really love is a bit like deep squish, like that. It's got a lot of punch, but it's this kind of wet, satisfying thing, not like a hard or piercing sounding attack. And that thuddy character to it is quite present, where the way the low end sounds is quite tight but impactful. It kind of gets you going in the chest. I really like how that one sounds. It does remind me again a little bit of like the kind of Oasis D4 sounds, like some of the kick drums there. I think there's one literally called The Thud, which, you know, has got a slightly similar feeling to this one, but of course doesn't have room mics in the way that this does. And finally, wet blip. So wet blip is a 20-inch kick drum, so it's a bit higher tuned. You can hear that. It's got like a bit of a higher voice, but it's got that real like beater on clear plastic sound to it. This is quite like a thrash metal sounding kick, I'd say. But it can be useful in a blend as well, just for adding a bit of that character to an otherwise maybe less exciting, less hyped sound. So that's it. That's all the kicks and snares in Slammers. Now, I think you'll agree that there's a lot of variation in there and there's not that much overlap, which I think is really exciting, because the last thing you want to do when you're kind of in this fun, creative space is just have an overwhelming list and find it difficult to remember the ones that you like. What's really nice here is if you spend a little bit of time clicking around them, you'll start to know exactly what you want when you're working, when you're mixing, and you'll find it really quick and easy to enhance and improve your drum sounds with this selection, I think. All right, having gone through all of the samples within Slammers, I thought what we really needed to do was check out a real-world example. We're going to look at one of the demo tracks which I put together for the Slammers release. This is very much focused at 2010s periphery, kind of very djenty guitar stuff. It's just been a lot of fun to put it together. So for the basis of this, I used the One Kit Wonder Modern Fusion. This was the first One Kit Wonder that we put out. And it's a good kind of bass for this, because everything's in quite a kind of neutral spot. The snare's kind of medium tuned. Nothing has too quirky a sound to it, and good sounding cymbals. So I'm using this for the main drums, basically for the cymbals and the toms more than anything. And I think this is the default setup state. I've got the parallel and master EQ on. I've pulled down the level of the kick and snare faders a little bit in order that we've got some more headroom to throw our one-shots on top without it all becoming too kick and snare heavy. And then on these two channels here, which are just receiving the same MIDI that's programmed above using Logic's alias system, I have instances of slate trigger 2. Now, I do think that slate trigger is probably the single best solution for using with these one-shots. However, you could very easily use Logic's built-in sampler, or even just paste in by hand the samples as you go, kind of depending on your workflow and what you like to do. It's just that with Trigger, there's quite a lot of flexibility, and the ability to make the MIDI input note sensitive just means that I can do what I've done, where I've taken an alias of the main drum MIDI and only will hear snare drums on this channel. It won't be kind of reading all the other MIDI as well. So I've got two instances of that. So I've got one for the kick and one for the snare. And all of that is going to the master channel, which just has FG Red, as I've been using a lot, and the God particle on it. So it's a pretty minimal session, as you can see. Just got a couple of guitar tracks, so 2 rhythms and a kind of ambient lead thing, and then 1 channel of bass. So yeah, very simple session. I think it sounds pretty good. I'll just give you a blast of how it's sounding right now. All right, cool. So hopefully you enjoyed hearing that, and hopefully you think it sounds good. Let's get straight into looking at the snare drum. So to supplement the snare in Modern Fusion, which I've pulled back in volume a little bit, as I said. So here I'm using the Empty Warehouse Close, Glorious Floater Close, and Empty Warehouse Room. And then the 3 of them together sound like... which in combination with Modern Fusion without. So as you can hear, that's quite a weird mix now because the natural snare and kick are quite quiet, so we're getting like quite a lot of room wash and not much impact. But yeah, you bring in that one shot and then the kick. One thing I definitely need to mention is that when you're placing samples on top of an existing recording, you need to make sure that the phase is the same. So you should try flipping, like inverting and uninverting the samples, just to make sure that they are working with and not against the punch in the original tracks you've got. You'll notice there's a lot more low end and a lot more kind of transient impact when they're in phase. Obviously, if you prefer the way it sounds when they're out of phase, that's totally valid too. And one thing to bear in mind is that all of the samples within slammers are of the same phase. So arguably, anytime you do a flip on one of them, you should do it on all of them, just so they all stay in good relative phase to each other. Here, actually having them flipped in phase sounded better. Those are the snares we've got. We'll get in a moment to actually checking out some different ones. And for kicks, we've got 4 here. We've got Gorilla Cannon, Deep Squish, Hyper Scoop, and Thick Thud Close, which there's very little of in the mix and probably could just be muted altogether. But as you can see, there's a bit of balancing going on here. So I'm actually using quite a lot of Hyper Scoop and boosting that up by 2.5 dB, a little bit less of Deep Squish, and kind of just at parity with Gorilla Cannon. That sounds like... So you can see straight away how cool it is to just go kind of blending the faders and get these different versions of, you know, more mid-rangey, more low-endy, more clicky, but all of them sound really good. So there's in no way you trying to kind of minimize something. You are trying to exaggerate and get creative, and I just love the kind of mindset and the process around that. Obviously, we're listening in isolation now. As you'd have heard earlier, this kick is making up a huge amount of the kick sound that you're hearing, even though it's a one shot. In this kind of style, it's quite appropriate for the kick to sound quite, one-shotty. So let's choose a few samples that I didn't use last time, like have no overlap at all. So let's go with maybe Big Boy. Let's go with Nasty Beast. It's a fun one. That's the kind of stadium rock one. And let's do Knock Knock. Let's see what those three sound like together. So you can hear how much that Knock Knock one is bringing in a lot of that kind of knocky character to the kick. So that kind of becomes a slider to bring out that kind of like 1K heavy sound should you want. Nasty Beast has got quite a lot of sustain to it. And Big Boy, I guess, is probably the most natural sounding of the three. Let's see what that sounds like with the rest of the kit. So right there in context, it became obvious. I was like, well, the kick sounds a little bit weak. Flip the phase and suddenly the kick's there in spades. So for this particular kit, one needs to invert the kicks. Unfortunately, every session is unique because of where you place the microphones in the room and how it's set up. So there's no one generic way of the polarity always being right. It's always just a question of doing this quick 180 flip to see which way sounds better. But that sounds pretty huge. Let's bring in the rest of the mix now. Sounds good, but I feel like I need something that's got a bit more click to it to help cut through. Let's just check out, I don't know. Maybe not that one. Maybe let's do Hyper Scoop. It is just so good for that. Might find that overall the kick level's a bit high now. I love how that sounds. It's so kind of solid and so percussive. I love how it's interacting with the rest of the mix. And this is obviously just a new blend that we've made up on the spot. So, you know, really different to what was there before. Let's move to the snare now and just try something different. So here we've got kind of both pretty mid-tuning, kind of low-endy sounding snares. Let's just clear all of these and let's bring in some new ones. So let's go a bit higher tune. That could be fun, right? Let's try out Plucky 13, Sprightly Pop, Tight Squink, and let's bring in the Room from Sprightly Pop as well. So we've got and let's see what that sounds like. I think we're going to need to flip all of these phases. Actually, no, sounds better phase this way around. See that in context? Something you definitely need to do is make sure that we're not triggering the soft hits very hard. So you can use the range control and the velocity control here just to ensure that ghost notes don't have a whole lot of one shot in them. Love how that sounds. Why don't we bring in another bit of room in reinforcement? You could use the grainy acro, because that's kind of higher tuned snare, but in a really big room. Now you could also go a little bit further on the processing here. I might just say add a tiny bit of high end because of the mix that we've got going on, just bring a little bit more fizzle out of the snares. That seems to work really well. So why don't we go and just, try a whole different set of snare samples and see what we get. Let's maybe go for some more characterful ones like the clipped copper close, slack beauty. Both of these together, we could maybe use something that's got a bit more crack to it. We could maybe use a little bit of the sticky supra to get a bit more kind of attack of that sort. And let's grab Maple Slam and Maple Slam Room as well. Let's listen to that in isolation. That sounds pretty cool. Let's see what that sounds like. I'd say with these particular samples, there's not as much high end, so maybe we can just do another little high end lift there. So as you can hear, that works. It's a totally different kind of sound. It's a bit more kind of, I guess you could say a slightly more boxy, dry snare sound, but in a deliberately, boxy kind of way. Those are tones that maybe would be more appropriate in a slightly more lo-fi rock setting. But despite that, we've still been able to enhance them with a little bit of EQ and get them to work in this kind of hyper modern sounding mix. So I think what I love so much about this particular set of samples is the variation and the creativity that it inspires during mixing to create kind of, both the process of blending, but also the process of selecting sounds that you might not instinctively reach for and knowing that you're still going to get like tons of impact and low end, and with just a little bit of EQ or processing can make them fit into any style at all. So I hope that this demonstration has kind of showcased what slammers can do for you. And I really hope that you find them to be trusty tools in your mixing arsenal. I've certainly found myself using little smidges of them on pretty much everything I do since finalizing the pack. I think they're just such a fun way to create extra excitement and power in your productions. So I hope that these serve you well and become the not so secret weapons in your arsenal and allow you to deliver mixes that you are super happy with, whether you're working on live acoustic drums or programmed drums, whether you're just creating music for yourself or doing big budget productions. I hope there's something in there for you. So thank you very much for watching, and let us know what you think.